The kitchen light flickered as the phone rang, sharp and insistent, splitting the quiet of the night. Julia hesitated before picking it up. It wasn't the first time she had answered a call like this. 14 years, countless false leads, hoaxes, and cruel jokes, she had learned to brace herself. Still, she pressed the phone to her ear. A low voice on the other end spoke a name she hadn't heard from a stranger in years. Ben, her son, the child she had lost in an instant and spent over a decade chasing through dead ends and empty promises. The man gave a detail that made her heart pound, a small scar on the inside of the wrist, one Ben had from a childhood fall. It was the kind of thing only someone who had seen him up close would know. She forced herself to stay calm, asked the usual questions. Where was he? How had he found Ben? Why now? But the voice on the other end was evasive, carefully choosing words that gave just enough without revealing anything real. When she pushed for something concrete, a picture, proof, he changed his tone. Do you want to find him or not? Her grip on the phone tightened. That was always the hook. A lead, a little truth wrapped in a lie, a desperate mother being asked just how far she was willing to go. She had fallen for it before. People who claimed to know where her son was, sending grainy photos of boys who looked just close enough, demanding money to help her reunite with him. This time, she didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between them. Then, just like that, the call ended. Julia sat staring at the phone, willing herself to breathe. She should let it go. She should delete the number, chalk it up to yet another sick joke, and move on. But she knew she wouldn't. Not yet. Because what if? 14 years ago, it had started on a day like any other. She had left Ben, just 5 years old, with her older sister while she went to work. A normal, ordinary afternoon. Nothing unusual. And then he was gone. No struggle, no forced entry, no sign of anything wrong, just vanished, like he had stepped out of existence. The police had searched, flyers had gone up, his face had been on the news. Every tip led to nothing. Every road ended in darkness. People had tried to be kind at first. The neighbors had offered sympathy. The cops had promised they would keep looking, and family had told her to stay strong. But as the months dragged into years, sympathy turned into avoidance, and then something worse, pity. They expected her to stop looking. They thought she should move on. But how did you move on from something like this? The years passed, and Julia built a life. She remarried, had 2 more children, laughed again, even found moments of happiness. But the ache never left. Every time the phone rang from an unknown number, every time she passed a boy on the street who looked about the right age, she felt it again. That terrible, gasping hope. She had been through it all. Psychics claiming they could see him. People pretending to be him. Strangers sending cryptic messages about where he was, only to disappear when she asked too many questions. And yet, here she was again. She pulled up the number, staring at it. If it was real, she couldn't ignore it. If it was another lie, she needed to know. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she made a decision. She called back. The line rang twice before cutting to voicemail. No name, just a generic message. Julia exhaled slowly. That should have been the end of it. Another dead lead, another cruel game. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this time, something was different. The way the man had spoken, the details he had given, too specific, too deliberate. It was just enough to plant a seed of doubt, and doubt was all it took to pull her back in. 14 years ago, she had promised herself she would never stop looking. Not until she had an answer. Real, undeniable truth. That was what kept her going, even when people told her to let it go, to accept the unthinkable. She scrolled through old emails, messages, and case files, searching for anything that might connect. Every lead she had followed, every dead end, every stranger who had claimed to know something, it all blurred together. But this was different. A scar. A single, undeniable fact. She had to know more. The police had given up long ago. The missing persons file still existed somewhere, gathering dust, but no one was actively searching anymore. To them, it was an old case with no resolution, a statistic that would never change. Julia had seen the looks they gave her when she called for updates. The polite, practiced sympathy, the quiet understanding that they didn't expect her son to be found alive. She refused to accept that. She pulled up a number she hadn't used in months. A private investigator, one she had hired before but had never been able to pay for long. He had been good, though. He had gotten close, closer than anyone else. The phone barely rang before he answered. "You still looking?" His voice was flat, as if he already knew the answer. Julia told him everything. The call, the scar, the way the man had spoken. She knew how it sounded, how desperate it must have seemed after so many years. But desperation was all she had left. There was a pause. Then finally, "Send me the number." She did. She waited. Hours passed with no response. She checked her phone every few minutes, even though she knew better. Leads like this didn't resolve quickly. She told herself to be patient, but patience had never been her strong suit. She dug through old files again, rereading the reports she knew by heart. The last known sighting, the neighbors who had seen nothing. The security footage from a gas station 3 miles away, showing a boy who might have been Ben, but the image was too grainy to be certain. She had dissected every frame, convinced herself it was him, convinced herself it wasn't. For 14 years, it had been a cycle. Hope, doubt, despair, repeat. Her phone buzzed. A message. Got a name. Working on an address. A name, not just a lead, a real name. She didn't recognize it. That didn't mean anything. People changed names. Identities shifted. But it was something. More than she had in years. She typed back, "Where?" Another pause. Then, "Texas. Small town. You up for a trip?" She barely hesitated. "I'll book a flight." The airport was a blur. She barely remembered packing, barely remembered getting there, but somehow she was on a plane, watching the city shrink beneath her. She had done this before, followed leads across the country, chased ghosts, returned home with nothing. But this time, something felt different. The investigator met her at a diner just off the highway. He looked the same, grizzled, tired, the kind of man who had seen too much. He slid a folder across the table without a word. Inside was a single photo. A young man, late teens, maybe 20. Lean, dark-haired, something familiar in the shape of his face. There was a name, too. Not Ben. Something else. Something new. "This him?" the investigator asked. Julia stared at the photo. She didn't know. She wanted to say yes. She wanted it to be true. But she had been wrong before. Julia traced the edges of the photo with her eyes, studying every detail. The curve of the jawline, the way his hair fell, something in the way he stood. It was familiar, but not enough. Her mind had done this before, convinced her that the face staring back at her was the one she had been looking for. 14 years was a long time. People changed. Boys became men. And memories, no matter how sharp, had a way of twisting into what you wanted them to be. She closed the folder and looked up at the investigator. "Where is he?" The man tapped a finger against the table. "Xavier works at a lumberyard outside of town. Quiet kid. Keeps to himself. No known family. No criminal record. Just exists." He leaned back slightly. "Someone went through a lot of trouble to make sure no one came looking for him. No digital footprint before 2013. Before that, it's like he never existed." Julia felt something tighten in her chest. "You think he was taken?" The investigator exhaled slowly. "I think if this is your son, someone didn't want you to find him." She had known this was a possibility. She had run through every terrible scenario in her mind 1,000 times. That Ben had been kidnapped, sold, lost in a system too broken to save him. That he had been raised by strangers, given a new name, told a different story about who he was. But knowing it in theory and hearing it out loud were two different things. The investigator slid her another paper. "I pulled employee records. This is his shift schedule. He should be at work tomorrow morning." She nodded, taking the paper without looking at it. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked. Julia didn't answer. The motel room smelled like stale air and cheap cleaning products. She sat on the bed, the folder open in front of her, memorizing every detail. The name, the address, the photo. She had imagined this moment for so long. 100 different ways it could go. Would he recognize her? Would he even care? There was a knock at the door. The investigator. "Figured you wouldn't sleep," he said. He was right. He handed her a burner phone. "If something feels off, call me. Otherwise, I'll be parked down the street." She nodded. The sun was just beginning to rise when she pulled into the lot. The lumberyard was exactly what she expected. Grit, dust, the sound of machines slicing through wood. And then she saw him. Not in a dramatic, slow-motion kind of way. No music swelled. No world-stopping moment. Just a young man moving between stacks of lumber, lifting, sorting, working, a routine so normal, so utterly mundane that for a split second she questioned everything. But then he turned, and she knew. It wasn't just the face, it was the way he moved, the way he stood. It was the way her mind filled in the blanks, replacing the boy in her memory with the man in front of her. Ben, Xavier, whoever he was. She gripped the steering wheel, forcing herself to breathe. She had spent years chasing this moment, and now that it was here, she had no idea what to do. Julia stayed in the car, watching him. The rational part of her knew she should wait, find a way to approach without overwhelming him. But rationality had never been a part of this journey. Every instinct in her body screamed to move, to close the distance, to say something, anything. She forced herself to think, what if she was wrong? What if she walked up to him, said his name, and he looked at her like she was crazy? Worse, what if he was Ben, but had no idea who she was? She had pictured their reunion in 1,000 different ways, but none of them prepared her for the possibility that he might not want to be found. He carried a load of lumber toward a truck, talking to a coworker. His voice was too far away to hear, but it was there. Real. Present. She had to do something. Julia stepped out of the car. She didn't approach immediately, just walked toward the small office near the entrance, keeping him in her peripheral vision. She needed a reason to be there, a way to get close without raising suspicion. The woman inside the office barely glanced up when Julia stepped in. "Looking for someone?" she asked, flipping through a stack of papers. Julia hesitated. "Xavier. He works here, right?" The woman squinted at her, as if trying to place her. "Yeah, you a relative?" Julia wasn't sure how to answer. "Something like that." The woman shrugged. "He's on shift until noon. You can wait outside." Julia nodded and stepped back out, her mind racing. She could feel the investigator watching her from his car down the street. She could call him, tell him she was out of her depth, ask what she should do next. But she already knew what he would say. There was no perfect way to do this. There was only now. Julia walked toward Xavier. He was finishing up a task, wiping his hands on his jeans when she got close enough to speak. "Xavier," she said, testing the name. He looked up. Their eyes met. A flicker of something. Curiosity, confusion, not recognition. She swallowed hard. "I." Her voice caught. 14 years of searching, of wondering, of imagining this moment, and now she couldn't speak. He waited, polite but guarded. She forced the words out. "Do you remember me?" A pause. Then, carefully, "Should I?" Her heart clenched. She wanted to believe this was just shock, that maybe something would click, that the years would unravel in an instant. But his expression didn't change. He didn't know her. Or worse, he did, and he was pretending he didn't. She reached into her bag, pulling out an old photograph. A boy, 5 years old, smiling at the camera. A frozen moment from a life that had been stolen from both of them. She held it out to him. His eyes flicked to it, then back to her. His expression stayed neutral, unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. Julia stood there, gripping the photograph, feeling the weight of all the years between them. She had prepared herself for a lot of things. Tears, anger, even outright denial. But not this. Not silence. Not a quiet, measured retreat, as if she were just another stranger in his life. Her first instinct was to follow, to call out his name, his real name. But she didn't. Chasing him wouldn't help. She had already learned the hard way that desperation made people run. She turned instead, walking back toward her car, her mind spinning. The investigator was still parked down the street, watching. She got in and closed the door, staring out the windshield. "What happened?" he asked over the phone the moment she called. He walked away. There was a pause. "That's not a no." She clenched her jaw. "It's not a yes either." "Give it time," he said. "He didn't call security, didn't yell at you to leave. That means something." Maybe. But maybe he had just learned how to hide his emotions, how to bury things so deep that even if there was a flicker of recognition, he wouldn't let himself feel it. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. The next morning, she parked down the street, drinking bad coffee, waiting. If she had to stay here for days, weeks, she would. At noon, Xavier left the lumberyard. No hesitation in his steps, no glances over his shoulder. If he was rattled by yesterday, he wasn't showing it. She followed, careful to keep her distance. He didn't go home, not right away. He stopped at a small diner. She waited a few minutes before going in after him, choosing a booth across the room, pretending to read the menu. He sat alone, eating without hurry. A normal day. A normal life. She couldn't stop staring. 14 years. She had spent so long imagining what had happened to him, picturing worst-case scenarios, fearing the unimaginable. But here he was, alive, whole, moving through the world like none of it had touched him. Except that wasn't possible. She wasn't the only one watching him. A man sat in the far corner, pretending to read a newspaper. Too stiff, too focused. Something was off. Julia felt it before she understood it. Who was he? Xavier got up to leave, and the man followed, careful, calculated. She didn't hesitate. She threw cash on the table and went after them. Xavier crossed the street toward a bus stop. The man kept his distance, but he was following. She wasn't the only one who had found him, and that meant something bigger was at play. Julia's pulse quickened. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone else was watching Xavier, tracking him the same way she was, but for entirely different reasons. She didn't know who the man was, but she recognized his type. Quiet, composed, the kind of presence designed to blend in. A professional. That meant someone had sent him, which meant Xavier was in danger. She kept her distance, her mind working through the possibilities. The investigator had told her someone had gone through a lot of trouble to erase Xavier's past. That didn't happen by accident. If this man was connected to whoever had taken him, then Xavier wasn't just missing, he was stolen. And now, they knew she was here. Xavier reached the bus stop and stood there, scrolling through his phone, oblivious. The man stayed back, leaning against a lamppost, glancing at him between sips of coffee. Julia made a choice. She stepped onto the sidewalk, closed the distance between herself and Xavier, and said his name, his real name, just loud enough for him to hear. He turned, startled, and that was all it took. The man in the corner tensed, his grip tightening on the coffee cup. Xavier didn't move. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something uncertain, unsettled. Julia didn't break eye contact. "We need to leave. Now." Xavier frowned. "Why?" Behind them, the man pushed off the lamppost and started walking their way. "Because you're not the only one being watched." Something in her voice made Xavier glance past her, spotting the man for the first time. And in that instant, Julia saw it, the shift in his expression, the recognition. He knew. He didn't just recognize the danger. He recognized him. Whoever this man was, Xavier had seen him before. Julia didn't wait for him to react. She reached for his arm, not to pull him, not to force him, but to make him move. And he did. They walked fast, slipping through the crowd, crossing the street as the man followed. But now, Xavier wasn't confused. He wasn't asking questions. He was leading. He knew where to go. They moved fast, turning down an alley, cutting through a parking lot, winding through side streets. Julia kept up, her mind racing. Then, finally, he stopped. They were behind an old auto shop, out of sight. Xavier turned to her. "Who are you?" Julia had waited 14 years for this moment. She met his eyes and said the only thing that mattered. "I'm your mother." Silence. Then quietly, "No, you're not." It should have hurt, but it didn't, because she understood. Whoever had taken him hadn't just stolen him, they had rewritten him. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the photo, and held it up. The same one she had shown him at the lumberyard. "You were 5, she said. "You loved dinosaurs. You had a stuffed blue T-Rex you wouldn't sleep without. You hated tomatoes, no matter how much I tried to sneak them into your food. And you had a scar on your wrist from when you fell off your bike in the driveway." His eyes flicked to the photo, then back to her. He didn't speak, but she saw the hesitation, the doubt, the crack in whatever story he had been told. Behind them, a car screeched to a stop. The investigator. He got out, glancing between them, then at the street behind them. "We need to go. Now." Xavier didn't move. "You don't have to believe me," Julia said, "but if you come with us, you'll get answers. The truth, no more lies." A moment, a choice. Then finally, Xavier exhaled and nodded. They got in the car and drove. For the first time in 14 years, Julia had her son beside her. Not completely, not yet, but close enough. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if Xavier would ever remember, if he would ever believe her. But she knew this. She had found him, and now she would help him find himself. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here and sharing in this journey. Some stories stay with us long after they end. and this is one of them. It's about hope, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between those who refuse to give up on each other. Your time, your thoughts, and your presence mean more than words can express. No matter where life takes us, may we always hold on to the belief that even in the darkest moments, light can still find its way through. Thank you again for being part of this.